Today, we are hearing from Dr. Sonyia Richardson and Dr. John A. Williams III, who both work in various areas of research and social education and social research. Dr. Richardson is a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is also the director of the Race and Social Equity Research Academy and the founder and director of the Mental Health Research and Practice Lab at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Williams is a professor of multicultural education at Texas A&M University at College Station in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Culture. Their shared publications include research articles entitled, Does Race Trump Training? Comparing teacher training, teacher race, and their effect on the educational attainment of Black students, and another work, Social Workers and Urban School Disciplines, Do We Need a Timeout? I would like to say thank you in advance so much to our speakers, as well as to the closed captioning and IT support, and I look forward to a lively discussion. I will include the agenda in the chat for your convenience, and a shareable link to this webinar will be included as well. Dr. Richardson and Dr. Williams, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant, and thank you for this invitation to present on a very timely and important topic. Today, we're going to spend some time with you discussing developing a research question and aligning data with a focus on secondary data as both an input and output to constructing and answering a research question. Again, I am Dr. Sonyia Richardson, and I have my co-presenter, Dr. Williams, with us here today as well. Just a basic disclosure for some research we have funded. Our learning objectives for today's session are to briefly describe the components and elements of a good research question. We're also going to apply and learn about idea generation and how to integrate ideas, and we'll talk about the integration of our research. We're going to learn how to discover and align data to answer complex questions, and we're also going to explain strategies for developing research questions using secondary data. So this image illustrates the pressures that we experience in research to create science that is perfect, that always ends up with optimal results. In quantitative research, we are often seeking statistical and sometimes clinical significance. We are pressured to demonstrate that we have discovered new knowledge and adding new ideas to the research. At the same time, there is a quote to the right by Niels Bohr, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922, and he stated, and I'll change one word to make it inclusive, an expert is a person who has made all of the mistakes which can be made in a narrow field. So in thinking about this, I want you to understand that as it relates to developing good research, we become experts through our mistakes, through trial and error, and by getting it wrong. We cannot be afraid to produce excellent science, but this requires us to fall and get back up again and try again. This is even more pertinent as it relates to developing a research question, as many of us have created numerous research questions, and that in the end, we were told perhaps were not quality questions. However, the trial and error and willingness to get it wrong is what helps us to develop skills for developing quality research questions moving forward. So let's be okay with not being perfect in order to advance science, as failure is a necessary part of the innovation process. So the importance of the research question. So we know that the research question is the most important part of the research process, as everything else relies on the question. It is the central part of the entire research process, but here's the important piece. Just because you develop a good research question does not mean you will produce quality research studies. Methodological considerations are also just as important. However, if you produce a low quality research question, a poorly designed study is sure to follow. So designing a quality question from the beginning is essential to having and producing and having better results of producing a quality study. So let's walk through a generic model for developing a research question. So I'll walk through generic, and then John is going to walk you through a more specific model for secondary data analyses and using data sets. So first, with this model has 6 steps, and I'm going to walk you through the 6 steps with an example from my research. So step number 1 is to identify a broad research problem and then a specific research problem. Research is always based on a problem. If there is no problem, there is no need to conduct research. We identify problems first, and then we propose questions to strategize ways to answer and solve these problems. These problems should preferably be based on your areas of passion or interest. And this is the first step that requires creativity, brainstorming, and deep reflection. So again, in this step, you start with a broad problem area, for example, the increase in Black youth suicide rates. And then I'm going to take that broad area and make it more specific. And more specific might be a problem statement such as limited research on the increase in suicide outcomes among Black adolescent girls. Okay, so I started broad and then I went specific. That would be step number one. Now, step number two is to review the literature. Now, some might say the review of the literature comes before step one, and yes, it can come there as well. But for the sake of today's presentation, I just listed it as number two. So with reviewing the literature, you're identifying what are others saying or are not saying about this problem. You're going to review the implications and conclusions of research papers to maybe see if they provided recommendations on next steps for topic areas or next items that need to be completed. You might also look at limitations to see what they didn't study. So you're looking at existing research to identify what are some of the areas where perhaps there's a problem and the problem has not been addressed. So some questions you might ask yourself when reviewing the literature include, is this specific problem an understudied area that has less research? Is this specific problem, a saturated area of research? Is this a problem that is still seeking a solution? And so you're thinking through those things. So if I take my area of research a step further, again, as an example, I might say to myself after review of literature, well, cyberbullying is a risk factor for suicide outcomes, and Black girls have been found to have a higher risk for cyberbullying. However, a less studied area is suicide outcomes and cyberbullying among Black girls. So from just reviewing the literature, I'm finding where there could possibly be some associations that perhaps people have not explored more or considered. So I started broad with the problem, went specific, reviewed the literature. Again, you could start with review of the literature, make it broad, and then go specific. So it depends on your style. And then step number three is to define the problem statement. A problem statement articulates the problem and an argument that explains the need for a study. You often find the problem statement in the abstract or introduction of an article. So we've already been including problem statements, whether we call them problem statements or not. But you will also find other people's problem statements in the abstract or the introduction, usually of the article. With the problem statement, you are defining what is wrong and what needs to be fixed and or what needs to be understood more. These are some things, 6 things for you to consider when you're creating a problem statement, and then I'll explain the example that I have posted for you. So just things to consider for your problem statements. You're identifying the problem. So what is wrong? What is wrong with the current situation? You might look at the context. What are some of the context issues or factors? You might also examine the scope of the problem. How big is this problem? So what is the scope of it? Consequences of the problem. What is the cost of not fixing the problem? So if we have increasing rates of cyberbullying, Black girls at high risk for cyberbullying, and we have increasing rates of suicide outcomes, Black girls are at an increased risk for suicide outcomes, those are some consequences that might need to be explored a little bit more. And the cost of not fixing that can be deadly. What are some of the gaps? What are some of the knowledge gaps? What information is lacking is the 5th area. And then area 6 that you might consider as you're defining your problem statement is how will the new study contribute to a solution? So the example I have for you for a problem statement, Black girls ages 13 to 18 in the United States, so you see the context, have increasing rates of cyberbullying and suicide outcomes. Cyberbullying is found to be a risk factor for suicide However, the association between cyberbullying and suicide outcomes among Black girls has been less understood. Understanding the association between these two variables may drive prevention and intervention efforts. And so not only could we examine prevention and intervention for suicide, but we could also examine it for cyberbullying based on if we find some association between these two areas. And so you see in that last line a proposed solution and how that's helping to perhaps drive the research in the field. Okay, so we have steps 1, 2, and 3, broad to specific, review the literature. Step 3, define your problem statement. And I honestly wish I had this years ago when I started doing research, because it would have made my process a lot easier, but I didn't have it. But hopefully this is helping you all. Step 4, I have 3 more steps for you. Step 4, you're going to develop a statement of purpose. The statement of purpose is a summary of the goal of the research study. This is where you state your specific purpose with this research. So for example, the purpose of this research is to, or the purpose of this study is to. This is also considered your specific aims. And you might find the purpose statement at the end of an introduction of an article or at the end of the literature review, or you may even find it in the methodology section. But usually the statement of purpose is also contained within existing literature or articles. And so my example for you, when I think about a statement of purpose for this topic, the purpose of this study is to identify the association between cyberbullying and suicide outcomes, and I've defined what outcomes I'm referencing, among Black girls in the United States, ages 13 to 18. So I'm hoping you're beginning to see some of the progression and some of the lines that you're actually going to put into your articles or your manuscripts to help align and define what you're actually studying. All right, so let's go to step number 5, develop draft research questions. So now you're going to just take that purpose statement that you developed and then draft several versions of the research questions. You are now taking a directive stance with your research question and just rewording your purpose statement into a research question. You are also adding in, if you have not already, and identifying your independent and dependent variables. So I have 2 example drafts questions for you, and you can look at those questions there. But I literally took the statement of purpose and then made those into questions. You're going to develop questions, and some are going to be really good and some aren't going to make any sense. And sometimes people will say that is not right. And it is okay. Develop your draft questions. As long as you're aligning everything with your literature, what you reviewed, the problems, et cetera, you now have that alignment. And so they're draft questions. So then after you develop your draft questions, step number 6 is to select a question that meets criteria for a good research question. And so you might ask, so what are the qualities of a good research question? And I'm going to cover that for you in a second. So you'll see for step number 6, I've just taken one of the 2 questions and just listed it down as an example of a question that I could select if I wanted to for this particular research. So walking through these steps 1 through 6 is a generic model for developing a research question, regardless of what type of study you're doing, qualitative or quantitative, mixed methods, et cetera. You can use the same 6 steps to help align your research and to ensure there's logic to the reason why you came up with your research question. So we've talked through the generic model for developing a research question. Let's now go to qualities of a good research question. And we have several qualities listed for you. So we know it should be narrow and specific, and we just talked about making sure you have a specific area of research. It also should address an important issue, should be guided by existing research. So you don't want to just make something up out of the blue and think, okay, this is a great idea. I can tell you all the time with anything that I'm doing in my everyday life, my family knows I'm always asking some type of question that could be framed as a research question, and it might not be important and it might not be interesting, but I'm asking those questions. With these questions, you want it to be something that's really addressing an important issue and that's guided by research. It potentially may respond to a controversy, and it's okay. It's important for us to be okay addressing some of those issues that are a little bit more controversial. It creates a new perspective. It should be progressive in nature. And as Dr. Williams and I walk through some of the research he and I have been able to complete together, you're going to see the progression in our research. And so if you look at some of my earlier research questions that I've done in earlier studies, and you see some of my current work, you'll be able to say, oh, okay, I see a progression. I see that she took maybe what she learned from the last study, or where there might have been a limitation and gap, and now she added onto it, and now she's studying that a little bit more. So you can even find like some problem areas, even within your own areas of research that can then become next topics. It needs to have a potential for impact, is an area of interest, is answerable, based on genuine curiosity, and is related to an area of interest or passion. You see that interest or passion a couple of times. It is really hard to do, I have found for myself, it is really hard to do good research that is engaging and interesting for me if it's not something I really care about. So at the end of the day, it's important for me to make sure I'm finding topics for which there is passion, and for which I could like stay up for days writing about or dream about and think about, because it's really important to me. All right, so let's talk about some of the debates about developing research questions, and I'll just walk through a couple of these with you quickly. So first, you have the deductive and inductive reasoning processes. Your deductive is going to be more of your top-down or your general to specific, while inductive is bottom-up or specific to general. Inductive approaches, we know, are generally associated with qualitative research, while deductive approaches are more commonly associated with quantitative research. However, there is some disagreement among researchers as to the best method to use when conducting research and gathering data. These two methods are not mutually exclusive and often address the same question using different methods. So there may be a style that you prefer when it comes to your research and your reasoning processes. And sometimes there's debate about which one it should be, but use what works for you. There's also the debate about gap spotting. Gap spotting is using various gaps in the literature to formulate specific research questions. Alvison and Sandberg of 2013 are critical of gap spotting because they argue that it fails to question the assumptions on which existing research is based. Gap spotting, in essence, expresses some faith in the existing studies and the assumptions on which they are based, and strives to then build positively on them. So if you find an article, you find some research, or you've been following some research with reviewing literature, and you see gaps, and then some people might say, well, look for where the gaps are, the gaps and holes in the research. And then you find those gaps, and then you then conduct a study based on the gaps that you're finding, where there's something that's not studied. Where you want to make sure you are paying attention is those gaps that you're finding. Are those studies credible? And are those studies well done? Because you don't want to find gaps in studies for which there might be some flaws. So that's one of the debates that you'll find in the field. Another debate is contradictions in the research. This is where you might identify questions that have not been answered completely or correctly. So people might have had good research questions, but they didn't completely answer them or correctly answer them. This makes sure that the question addresses a deficiency, absence, or omission. So this involves some critique of existing research, and there's some debate about that method. Also, the originality of research using secondary data. You all have probably heard this one before, where there's sometimes the notion that using secondary data, is that a real research study? Like, that's not real. But we would argue using secondary data is a useful resource for original work and data. This work does help to move the field forward, and it does not discount the importance of empirical research. But using secondary data and aligning your research questions with secondary data can have an impact as well in the field, and it is a real, legitimate, justified study. And then the last argument is judging the importance of research questions. Don't judge the importance of your research questions based on how often they appear in the literature, as some of the more popular questions may not be studied, because of the controversy surrounding them. So we've seen lots of studies now that deal with racism and discrimination. But years ago, those were controversial areas, and you might not have seen the literature saturated with that information. And so you don't want to judge how important is my topic based on how much content is out there, or justify your topic based on how much content is out there, because sometimes people avoid topics because they're controversial, or there's some stigma associated with it. All right, so Dr. Williams and I are going to talk a little bit about our backgrounds, and then you'll be able to see kind of how we move forward with the next part of this session. So Dr. Williams, would you like to introduce your background, your research?
Indeed. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you all at. Just a brief introduction of my research. So specifically, I always call it my bread and butter is school discipline, particularly looking at Black students, and then I kind of expand from that aspect, taking a more interdisciplinary look. Because going back to what Dr. Richardson said, when I was in graduate school, the word was, well, everyone's talked about school discipline. What do you have to add? And the best thing that I think she added was going to the literature to figure out what's going on really helped me to see we haven't figured it all out, because if we figured it all out, we would not be still seeing these discipline disparities that continue for Black children, but also different children from diverse populations. My second one deals with preparing culturally inclusive teachers and administrators. And the reason why I say teachers and administrators is particularly because we have tons of words: culture responsive, relevant, sustaining, revitalizing, but really, how do we make these individuals understand what inclusivity looks like? Because we understand school administrators often come from where? Teachers. So we have to look at both of these groups together. And particularly, I couch this lens under urban. I can look at all places, but for me, what matters and what my passion is about is looking particularly in urban areas. And you'll get to see that a little bit later on as we talk about the study that we use, how to develop a research question, along with pairing it with the data that was available to us. Go ahead, Dr. Richardson.
All right, so thank you. So I am a social scientist focused on identifying and removing barriers to mental health treatment for Black youth. These barriers include educational risk factors, such as disproportionate school discipline outcomes, disparate academic outcomes, and racism that influence mental health outcomes for Black youth, particularly also in urban environments. And lastly, I also test and refine novel behavioral interventions aimed at reducing suicide outcomes and improving mental health outcomes among Black youth. So those are my areas of research. And we just want to give a shout out to the Urban Education Collaborative at UNC Charlotte under the direction of Dr. Chance Lewis. As a mentor, he really helped us understand how to generate ideas and how to connect our areas of research. All right, so what we're going to do now is walk you through our process of our idea generation, and then John will take over after I cover the slide here. So John and I Dr. Williams and I happened to be at a writing retreat sponsored by the Urban Education Collaborative, and we started having conversations about what we were seeing with data. And this is a slide about circumstances preceding suicide among Black and white children ages 10, I'm sorry, it cut off. I think it's 10 to 17 in the United States from 2014 to 2017. And I was reviewing this data and I was talking to Dr. Williams. And one thing that I noticed in this data is this last line that says school problem. And preceding circumstances prior to death. So what we know among Black youth is rates of suicide are increasing at rates higher than white youth. White youth are having decreasing rates of suicide, but it's increasing for youth of color. And so my question, and what a lot of people are asking is, well, why is this happening? What's happening? And so when I noticed the school problem and that the non-Hispanic Blacks, 25%, had some type of problem at school prior to dying by suicide, then I started asking, okay, what was happening at school? What were some of the problems? What were they experiencing? And so this is the data I brought in. And then there's one more, sorry. This is circumstances preceding death by suicide among Black children ages 10 to 17, so it is 17, by sex. So now I started to look at it from gender, and I'm going to look over here because I am a little over the age bracket where my eyes work up close. And so anyway, so when you look here and I look now at school problem here. And now this line with the dashes is Black males, the dark blue line or dark purple line, whatever, is Black females. Now I'm saying there's something going on here with Black females where a higher percentage of the Black girls had something going on at school that preceded their death by suicide. The Black males also were around like maybe 22, 23%, but there's something going on here. So now I'm asking questions, okay, what's going on with these kids based on sex? It seems like there's maybe some slight differences with sex.
All right. So Dr. Richardson provided her element, and we were at this writing retreat. So I was like, of course, when you team up, you got to bring something to the party. You just can't come to the party without bringing anything, especially when it comes to idea generation. So my background being in school discipline is that I know the data. We've known since literally Brown versus Board of Education that Black kids have been over suspended, over referred to law enforcement and things of that nature. And we see this consistently every single year in all data points. It's a national epidemic, and it's something that's been consistent. Me having that understanding, even without looking at the data, once we started to have that conversation, and she said school problems, one thing that we know for a school problem for Black children is school discipline. So this is national data, and this is actually data from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. While it says 2021, please keep in mind, the date that they produce it is lagging behind the data, the actual data comes out from the year. So this is from the 2017-2018 year. Mind you, this is the most recent, keep that in mind, most recent data set that they have. It's a national data set. But we look on here, Black children are literally 7.7% of the population, Black boys. Black girls are 7.4% of the population. But if we look at suspensions, now we're not looking at expulsions, referrals. 20% of those suspensions are in-school suspensions for Black boys, 24.9 are actually out-of-school suspensions, one or more. And then we look over in the girls category, we're looking at 11.2 and 13.3 versus every other counterpart, particularly white counterparts. We notice that enrollment to suspension number is kind of close. For Black children, there's a separate. So we know there's disproportionality, and there's numerous studies, again, knowing the literature, that shows that Black children are overrepresented in school discipline outcome. So as we sat down, we got to talking about, okay, what is our research question? We know these connections have not been made before. And that's, again, us knowing our research questions and knowing our research field, we know that there has not been any type of connection between school discipline and suicide ideations for Black children based on gender. So next slide, please. As we transition and we looked at it, our questions and develop a research question, we had to then ask ourselves first, increase knowledge about secondary data sources available that are specific to your areas of research. So even though we knew our data sets, we had to go dig a little bit, pretty much in depth. It's like, okay, we want to research this, but what data is out there that actually can get us to somewhat of a resolution of we can actually do this study. Number two, understand the variables that are measured in your data sources. How often are they measured and the limitations of the measurement? And I say that because, for example, the Office of Civil Rights database, it's every 2 years. So if I wanted to do a longitudinal study, I could not go every single year. I have to then say, okay, well, I'm looking at 2017, 2018. I have to match other data sets if I want to merge them with them together based on that same year, because I know the information is gathered, is collected at the end of the school year. So it means it's totaling all the incidents that happened, reports on STEM, reports on school support personnel in there, and it's compiling a thing and is reported to Office of Civil Rights at the end of the year. Number three, review literature and or your recent publications to identify ways to progress the existing research. So we've done a study previously that actually looked at social workers in school discipline and being their access within a district, and does that really matter for all children? And we did all races to see, does having a social worker actually impact someone's ability to be disciplined or the risk that they would be disciplined in a particular urban school district? Next slide, please. Number four, you really have to take the time to brainstorm and develop draft research questions. And again, why we say draft research questions, because you could come to the data and the data may say, you can't do that research question. You know, you may not have enough data to do that research question, or the data may not be out. Don't be afraid to step into new territory when developing your questions, because again, while we have numerous studies out there, advancing the field often means taking that next step and looking at data from a perspective that others haven't looked at before. Number 5, select a question that meets the qualities of good research questions and is the next step to your research progression. This may be using more advanced statistical analysis. This may be using different qualitative methods that you've never touched in before. But again, it extends your research line and it gets you closer and closer to answering that one burning question that you may have, or it may get you closer to providing that solution that eliminates these disparities. And lastly, number 6, refine your question based on the review of available data, secondary data sources. I can't stress this enough, and this is shout out to the Peers Hub. Having access to secondary data aids you in times when you can't get out there in the field. Knowing this data is important, and I'll give you something that we all know about. COVID-19 hit, and anybody who knows that we had to deal with IRB knows, and if you were working in schools and persons, you could not get out there. Schools are still reluctant to let individuals in their school. Having secondary data and understanding which secondary data sources are out there that can help answer some of your research questions is a gem. So do not look over this and say, well, I'll just leave the secondary to the side. Get to know some of these data sources because, again, they will help you in the long term be able to produce quality research and extend your research line. Next slide. So this is an active exercise. I mean, active, and this is like recent for us. So as Dr. Richardson said, we went to this writing retreat and we came up with the topic of investigating disciplinary risk in urban high schools as a precursor for suicide-related behaviors among Black students. And if you look at our research questions, the first one is, how does the risk of being suspended relate to suicide outcomes? And when you look at the word outcomes, we talked about suicide consideration, meaning they're actually considering suicide, planning suicide, or an attempt to suicide, particularly looking at one group, Black high schools. And I'll get into this a little bit more with the data, but we wanted to focus on this particular group. Again, knowing that there are school problems that are precursors for them to commit suicide, also knowing that school discipline is a large issue in all schools, but also in high school as well. And then the second question is, what is the relationship? Key phrase, relationship. And again, Dr. Richardson talked about there's certain buzzwords that kind of indicate the type of methodology that you are trying to attempt with your study. What is the relationship between employing school support personnel in the school district and Black student suicide ideation, planning, and attempts? And again, the school support personnel is progression beyond our original study that just looked at social workers. So as we look at that, as I put at the top here, it says there's levels to data. And I'm a data junkie. I'm the kid that just, like, if you all know about Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza, I'm gonna date myself to like to jump into play balls and just hang around. That's me and data. Just jumping in, really figuring out, okay, what is this data saying? What does it do? What can't I do? What are the limitations, but what are the strengths? And again, big shout out to the Peers Hub, because all these data sets that I'll be talking about that are on the right side, they have them available. Like, you click a link, you go to another link, you're there. I can't press this enough on graduate students who are listening right now. Use this to your advantage. I get a number of graduate students say, Dr. Williams, I can't find data. Peers Hubs have it. They got the links to everybody. So there's levels to data. So if you're thinking about research questions that are national, you're looking at it more of a macro lens. So this is the 30,000 foot view. So you may want to make assertions about Mexico, United States, Japan, South Africa, et cetera. You need more national data set to kind of make this claim. You may decide to go regional. So for example, you may say, hey, you know what? I really want to particularly look at West Coast because there's a phenomenon going out there that is different than the rest of the United States. Eastern Europe, Southern United States, these are more regional data sets. And again, sometimes national data sets, you can disaggregate the data to get the regional sets. Of course, there's also state data, and each state has their own data, but there's also state data within sometimes regional and national level. Then we get down to locale. And I always do locale because locale matters, urbanicity matters. So I'll use my hometown, East St. Louis, which is considered an urban city. Shiloh, which is kind of a little bit farther away from it, is considered to be suburban. And then what we would consider rural Illinois would be DuPont, Illinois. But these places based on urbanicity may have different contexts that you have to explore with your data. We break it down even further to their school districts. And from school districts, we can break down further to there's individual institutions. So you may be looking at a specific school, you may be looking at a specific university or college. Understanding where your data exists and where it sits in like this umbrella of things matters. And of course, there's population groups. So for our study, we looked at Black children. There's gender, socioeconomics, nationality, sexual identity, language, a host of other things that are listed at the group level. And lastly, which is also the most difficult to get access to, is micro level data. And micro level data basically is the data that you put out. So if I take a survey, you can get Dr. Williams' actual answers. You may not get my name behind it, but you have this micro level data that says, hey, if I want to make some type of assertion about Dr. Williams, I got 100% the chance to make it because I have micro level data. So examples of data sets that are located on the Peers Hub. And again, I've highlighted these things in green because these are the data sets that we pulled from. Office of Civil Rights Database, which is biannual, every 2 years, this data set comes out. It's been delayed because of COVID. So hopefully we get a batch this year. There's the American Community Survey. It's yearly, and actually it's a snapshot of the census. A census happens every 10 years. The American Community Survey happens in between that time. So it's very important to understand that this is a snapshot of what's going on. They're not assessing everybody. They're just giving us a snapshot of particular regions, particular zip codes, and things of that nature. Of course, we know the United States Census. The National Assessment for Educational Progress, or NAEP, that gives a national look, and it also gives a state look of different progress in social studies, literacy, mathematics, and things of that nature. There is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, which Dr. Richardson brought in. We have an integrated post-secondary education data system, which is IPEDS. I've actually was part of a cohort this past spring that looked at it and looked at how socioeconomics impacts whether or not students matriculate through PWIs and HBCUs for your institutions. And there's a little known database that most people know about is the Common Core database. Common Core database keeps very descriptive information about schools. How many individuals have free and reduced lunch? What is the urbanicity of things of that nature? And these are just some of the data sets. Again, it's expansive. I went to the website, I'm like, it's a treasure trove of data, and it has national data, but it also has access to international data as well. And of course, there's state. So you can get certain state information from national databases. However, shout out the Peers Hub again, they have every state's website that you can go to get their data sitting on the website. Again, you go to Peers, you click a button, you literally have all the states. I know this because I checked it out myself. And so these are just the two areas that we're looking at when it comes to national data and state data. But again, you can pull from these different data sources to help build on a foundation to the research question you're trying to answer. Next slide. So I know what you're saying. Dr. Williams is a billion colors on here, and I color coded this because I'm an artistic person, but it'll help you understand the flow. So on the left, these are questions you need to ask yourself when collecting data. And again, this is collecting data. We can do a whole seminar on screening and cleaning data because it takes that just much more time to do. Does my data have the variables that align with my question? When merging data sets, do the years match? If you got a data set that's 2017, 2018, don't tell me your research question is 2009. That doesn't match. What assertions can I make about the findings? And again, you can't out there, we call it reaching, when you're saying, hey, I got a sample size of 30, so I can talk about everybody in the country. You can't make that. That's a leap. Also, what type of analysis can I run? Are you looking for trends? Are you looking for associations or relationships? Again, relationships, buzzword. Differences between groups within groups, multi-level hierarchical analysis, structural equation, or longitudinal. And then lastly, are the variables estimates? Are they raw numbers? Are they composite? These are things you need to understand and know if you're going to use secondary data. Because again, you didn't draw this data, someone else did. But we have data sitting around this country that goes wasted every single year because people don't often use the secondary data. We need to use it. So if we're looking at the example that I gave earlier, it says investigating disciplinary risk of out-of-school suspension. So if I look at that right there, that orangish color, that data was pulled from the Office of Civil Rights database for 2017 and 2018. Now, you'll see the double asterisk up there that says NCES ID. That means I can match schools based on that ID to the Common Core database because the Office of Civil Rights does not have urbanicity in it, but the Common Core database does. So when we switch over to urban high schools, I can then say, wait a second, I just want to pull high schools that are urban. I can flag those things when I merge my data sets based on the ID. Now I know which schools from the offices of our database are urban schools. I can filter out all the suburban schools and rural schools. Next part, it says, as a precursor for suicide-related behaviors. And again, this goes down to the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. And notice I said 2018 asterisk. The survey is provided at the end of the 2017-2018 year. So right there, we've coupled up. We've matched 3 of our databases together and know that they go together and we can use them moving forward. Lastly, among Black students, again, the Office of Civil Rights database provides total enrollment numbers, but allows us to disaggregate based on race of which students are in the school. So then we barrel down to our research questions. How does the risk of being suspended relate its relationship to suicide outcomes, i.e. suicide consideration, plan, or attempt for Black high school adolescents? So when we talk about risk, there's a formula for school discipline that's called disciplinary risk or risk ratio that we needed to calculate, but I can calculate that number based on research, because I've done the research before, and other research from the Office of Civil Rights database. Also, we want to notice that also highlighted in like that bluish color is the US Census. The US Census told us which cities are the most densely populated that are urban and have the highest racial ethnicity when it comes to Black individuals. That was one of our driving things, that we don't want to look at all urban areas. What urban areas are we looking at? And also, when we look at these urban cities, can we find these urban cities within our other data sets? So for example, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, while it covers a lot of micro level data for students, it's not carrying every single urban city. So we had to truncate down and say, let's look at these urban cities because these urban cities meet the check mark for every single one of the things that we're looking for in these data sets. So the last question is, what is the relationship between employing a school support personnel? And again, I know that support personnel is listed in the Office of Civil Rights database. They give you the number of full-time support personnel. So school resource officers, social workers, counselors, and things of that nature. So understanding the different components allows us to say, hey, we have an overarching topic, but our research questions can differ. So the first research question, when we use the word relate, we use the correlational study. We did a Pearson correlation study to see, is there even a connection of this? Because again, no one has tested it before. No one looked at it before. Second, we say, is the relationship between employing a school research officer, so school support personnel in a school district, because we understand schools are sharing support personnel. Everyone is not one-to-one. So we know they're floating across the district. So let's look at this from a district level statement. So in making our statement, we're saying, hey, does disciplinary risk in a district impact suicide outcomes? Does access to these individuals who work within the district impact suicide outcomes by not only for Black students, but also gender as well? So when we make our assertions, we're saying we're looking at select urban school districts. We're looking at Black high school students. Particularly, we took the risk survey that dealt with high school students, and we eliminated everyone else, only 9th grade through 12th grade, which isolated our sample. We looked at boys and girls, and we also look at school discipline risk with suicide outcomes. Next slide, please. And this is an example of our research, the research that we've actually done together, but that aligns with our specific research interests. So as you can clearly see, our names pop up together a lot. They also pop up together separately. But these are secondary data sources that we utilize to create publications. And again, in academia, that's the Willy Wonka ticket, as I say, is being able to produce publications and getting these things out consistently with quality. And if you notice on this side, it's actually bolded are the ones we partnered up with. And you've seen that some of the times Dr. Richardson is taking the lead, some of the times I've taken the lead, sometimes we've teamed up with other people. And I would like to really stress this upon you. Find individuals, and this is me and Dr. Richardson's model, find individuals who have similar work metabolism as you. Dr. Richardson can call me in a minute. We would literally sit down for a writing session and lightning struck. And from that, we were able to not only generate one publication, we got a couple more that's in the pipeline that we're working on based on these ideas, but also understanding how do we formulate great research questions, but also how do we take the data that we know is sitting out there. This is tax-funded data that's sitting out there that we can use to answer questions that have not been answered yet, or redress certain issues that were talked about back in the 90s when certain things were controversial that we can actually talk about right now. So next slide. This is our contact information. You would like to reach out to us. Dr. Richardson is Assistant Professor of Social Work, the School of Social Work, University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She has her email up there. She has her Twitter handle up there as well. You can also reach me as well. I'm Assistant Professor of Multicultural Education in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Culture at Texas A&M University. You have my email up there as well, and my Twitter handle. So we thank you all for coming out. We understand you all are super busy. We are in the middle/end of the summertime, but we appreciate you all sharing your time with us and learning. And please share this information to whoever you may know, because guess what? Everyone can use secondary data sets if you know where to go and you know how to create quality research questions.
That was amazing. I wish I could hear the resounding round of applause for you guys, because I know it's out there. We're all just going to applaud, and you're going to get the energy from all over the world. Thank you all so much. It was so good, and it was so rich. And I always appreciate hearing from you guys. I've worked with John and Sonyia before, and they never disappoint. So I hope you guys got everything you needed out of this as well. If you didn't see in the chat, I mentioned several times that we will be sending the recording, a link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides to your email, the email that you use for registration. We only have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to kind of try to tackle a few of the questions that I saw repeatedly. One thing that I saw a few people mentioned, if you guys wanted to kind of briefly talk about, is there a difference when you are trying to create a research question for a qualitative study versus a quantitative study or a mixed method study? What should people keep in mind in that sense?
I'll jump on this one. According to the slides on there, I kind of use the similar process when I'm looking at both. Okay, what are the gaps? What does the literature say about what's going on, particularly for quant and qual? Mixed methods, I don't want to say it's tricky, but often I find that individuals say, well, I just did quant, I did qual, I got mixed methods. And it's like, that's not necessarily mixed methods. Do we have research questions that are working with each other together as tandem to answer either one or two, solve one or two problems using quant data and qual data? Because you need qual because it answers certain questions. You need quant because they answer some questions. But are they synergizing together? That's a real mixed method study to help you get to the answer that you're looking for. So again, I use those processes for quant and qual. Mixed, I gotta get a little bit more in depth, because again, I have to make sure they're not duplicating themselves, but also they're not in isolation when it comes to my research study.
Did you want to say, okay, good. Okay. What is the definition of secondary research? If you could just tell us what that is real quick.
So in a nutshell, secondary research is the use of existing data that has been collected, as Dr. Williams stated, whether it's at a national level, regional level, et cetera, is using already collected data and not engaging necessarily in the process of collecting your own data. So it's using other data sets that are existing to drive the research.
So Dr. Richardson, you had a few slides that showed us how to develop the research question and kind of how to get it started. Just to dive in a little bit deeper to give folks a little bit more to take away with on that, how can people make sure that their research question is good after they have it? How do they know that I've arrived at a good one? How do we know it's not too broad? And how do we know that it's actually going to speak to some sort of data source that it can be answered?
Yeah, so definitely a great question. So there were some criteria for strategies for developing a good research question. The key is, once you develop that question, of course, making sure it's specific in nature. Does it address an important issue? Is it addressing a problem? So following those steps that we outlined really helps to ensure that you're addressing something that's really important. But then once you start to develop your methodology, so how you're actually going to execute that research study, you'll begin to find and discover, okay, is this really a good question? Because if you're not able to align your methodology in such a way where you can actually answer that question, then perhaps that's not really a question that's answerable to begin with. And so it's developing that question. And then as you execute and develop and plan for your methodological approach, as Dr. Williams talked about, if there are tweaks that you need to make in your research question, that designing the methodology process helps you to do that.
Dr. Bryant, I got a quick jump in because I've been watching chat because I'm nosy. So I got a quick clarification. So with secondary data, let me clear this up right now. Secondary data that is public, you do not need IRB for. Let me make that specifically clear. You do not. Now, if it's micro level data and it requires some like transaction between institutions, then yes. But if it's publicly available data, you do not need IRB for it. And trust me, there's research on that. I know people who've gotten full professors on secondary data analysis using public. And you again, also, I saw another comment on there about making sure your chair is comfortable with using secondary data analysis. Again, that's a whole other conversation, but yes, you do want to make sure that they're comfortable with that. But again, people need to understand this is live data. There are humans in this data. We can't just look at these as numbers and they're telling a story. And so often we look over and say, well, somebody else collected it. Well, let's be clear. If you're on this call somewhere in the United States, your tax dollars have paid for somebody to collect this. We need to use this data because we have problems we can solve. And there's already people collecting the data for years. The Office of Civil Rights Database actually was produced by Congress first because they saw disparities going on. This is back since the 1950s. We have this data sitting there and we have to use it. So I had to interject there for that thing. But again, IRB on microdata, some graduate students have to do that. But if it's publicly available data, you can argue, I do not need IRB and it will be legitimate.
And kind of just to piggyback off what Dr. Richardson said, yes, your research question can change. It probably will over time. It's going to be fluid as you get into the literature, as you start to look at the research. And I saw someone mention, like, what if I don't have a reference for something? You become the citation. If you are the PhD, if you are the doctor, take that away with you today. Become the citation. If you don't see the answers to the questions that you're asking, then that's where we need you. You know, that's where you belong, where you can't find the reference. So yes, be open to your question changing throughout the process of you conducting your research because it's almost inevitable. All right, do we have any final takeaway? I know there are still more questions and I'm sorry, we are pushing up against time, but I will send the slides and Dr. Richardson, Dr. Williams, we thank you again. Feel free to reach out to them. They are just as cool as you think they are. All right, thank you all so much. And we'll see you next time. Please visit the Peers Hub and register. Bye-bye.